Yes, good morning, Your Honors. My name is Natalie, and these are my colleagues Jordan and Cooper. We will be addressing the question for Unit 1.
The first question then, we'll jump right into it, is what is the rule of law and what is its relationship to limited government and constitutionalism? And within that question, if you can talk a little bit about how you distinguish between the rule of law and rule by law, and why is that distinction important? And also, what principles were established in the Magna Carta, and how are those important to the rule of law and the later development of constitutionalism?
Dwight D. Eisenhower once said, "The clearest way to show what rule of law means to us in everyday life is to recall what has happened when there is no rule of law. Rule of law is the principle that both those who govern and those who are governed are bound by the law." Limited government and constitutionalism use rule of law to both empower and limit the government. Rule of law relates to limited government by helping to keep restraints on the powers as specified by the Constitution. For example, the government is not allowed to pass ex post facto laws or bills of attainder. Rule of law also prevents officials from acting arbitrarily and flouting the Constitution, which can lead to abuses of power. It also makes sure that everyone who breaks the law is punished, preventing persons of status from acting with impunity, which helps to foster equality. Rule of law relates to constitutionalism simply because the Constitution was created as the fundamental and supreme law which everyone must follow, including those in power. Under limited government, the Constitution was created to empower the government while concurrently restraining and separating specific powers of the government. An example of this is the President's ability to veto a law passed by Congress and the capability of Congress to override the President's veto. These limitations further enforce the idea of rule of law.
Rule of law is the absolute supremacy of the law over everyone, even government officials. By contrast, rule by law implies that the sovereigns are above the normal function of the law. In a rule by law government, corruption will be rampant because there will be no way to check the powers of government officials and try them for corruption. In a rule of law society, government officials can be held accountable for actions that are illegal or abuse the authority of public office. One example of this is the Supreme Court case U.S. v. Nixon. Nixon claimed he had executive privilege and maintained that he did not have to turn over secret tapes subpoenaed in a criminal case. The Supreme Court ruled that there were fundamental demands of due process of law in a fair administration of justice, and that these were demanded even of the chief executive. Under rule by law, Nixon could have asserted executive privilege and been immune. Machiavelli's The Prince, for instance, actually encourages rulers to break laws to achieve their goals. An example of a rule by law government is Queen Ramalona I, who ruled Madagascar in the 1820s. She repeatedly murdered other members of the royal family to acquire the throne and publicly admitted to it to prove her ruthlessness. Since Madagascar of the 1820s was a rule by law society, she could not be imprisoned or even charged with a crime.
In 1215, English barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, which established the principle that the king does not have absolute power and can be held responsible for his actions. The Magna Carta also introduced the idea of forcing rulers to make decisions on known principles instead of on their own arbitrary discretion. This was an early form of rule of law. These and other principles contained in the Magna Carta would eventually lead to the development of our constitutional government. The Magna Carta provided for due process of law, which required the government to follow established procedures and not act subjectively. The idea of a redress of grievances was also originated from the Magna Carta. The barons who drew up the Magna Carta believed the king should be responsible for compensating the people for wrongs or losses caused by the crown's infringement on common law rights. The principles of rule of law, the right to due process, and redressing grievances all help to create an enduring constitutional government by providing the people with ways to safeguard their rights and limit government power.
Thank you, Your Honors. We are now ready to take your questions.
In your own words, can you describe what the origin of the concept of natural rights, where that comes from? What do we call them natural?
Natural rights come from two places. They come from English philosophers who articulated the idea of natural rights, and they also come from this so-called state of nature. English philosophers, including John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, believed in a state of nature. People had rights such as life, liberty, and property, and that these rights were inalienable, and that they were rights you were born with.
The idea of rights, of inalienable rights that come from a state of nature, are further enforced via social contract theory, which both takes away the rights that you had, some rights that you had in a state of nature, to ensure that you can maintain other rights in safety and security of a government under a social contract.
There's another question. Do you believe that most people today can agree about what natural rights are? And what different or additional natural rights can you think of?
In a general sense, most people can agree that natural rights include life, liberty, and property, but there are some rights in which people may believe are their natural rights. The right to privacy and the right of marriage are sometimes thought to be natural rights to some people.
A lot of the so-called natural rights that are not confirmed by everyone to be natural rights are highly debated and even have led to Supreme Court cases. For example, Roe versus Wade, which dealt with the idea of privacy, and Loving v. Virginia, which dealt with the idea of marriage.
How did John Locke distinguish between a government and a legitimate government, and why is that distinction important?
In order for a government to have legitimacy, the government must have the consent of the people. John Locke stated that legitimacy comes from having power and authority. And in order for the government to have power, it has to have a source of that power. And in a democratic government like ours, the source of the power is the people. And in order for legitimacy to happen, there has to be consent of the governed. And we have that in our Constitution through the words "we the people," which are very plainly there in the Constitution, which imply that we've given consent to be governed, and also through
To add on to what my colleague has said, John Locke extremely believed that the government's purpose was to protect the rights of the people, and so therefore the people should be in charge of the government. And that is what makes a legitimate government in comparison to a regular government, which would not respond to the people's wants and needs and just rule sort of as a rule-by-law government where the people were not incorporated into the ideas and the leaders had supreme control.
Can you describe at least 3 provisions in the Constitution that provide a means for preventing the abuse or misuse of governmental power, and explain how these provisions might work in our system of government today?
The idea of judicial review is a main provision in the Constitution which prevents any kind of power. Judicial review is the check of the judiciary on the other 2 houses.
To expand on what my colleague has said, judicial review is the idea of the judicial branch to declare acts and laws, acts by the executive branch and laws passed by the legislative branch unconstitutional or constitutional. This check has been used quite frequently throughout history, and recently is being used by federal court judges to determine the constitutionality of Obama's health care plan.
Checks and balances are the main way, other than the consent of the people, that we keep our government in line and uncorrupt. Another significant check is the presidential veto power. The first time this was ever used, it was effective, and it continues to be effective today. George Washington used it for the first time to veto a law that would stagnate the size of Congress. He vetoed on constitutional grounds.
And a third principle that can be used to limit the power of the government is the impeachment power, which allows for elected officials to be indicted and tried for crimes that they may commit in office. And this helps to limit the power of the officials by preventing them from acting arbitrarily and breaking laws, knowing that they can be removed from office and have their careers destroyed.
I'm just going to ask a follow-up to that question about checks. What, in your view, I guess, is the most significant check within our federal system?
I personally believe that judicial review is the most important check within the system because it helps to uphold the ideas in the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. And without judicial review, I feel that the Constitution may not be upheld and there would be a lot more
Time?
Your Honor, I see my time is up. May I have a minute to briefly conclude my statement?
Sure.
Judicial review helps to uphold the Constitution, and I feel that without judicial review, the Constitution might not be interpreted the way that it should be interpreted. Thank you.
Just a couple brief comments. I thought that especially in your opening, the examples that you gave were fantastic. I would say that there were a lot of examples packed into a very short, and part of that is just the format that we have here. But so perhaps maybe you could use one example and all three of you play off it so that we could get more further development of it. I thought that Natalie, that was great. I think you worked as a great team. You jumped in when your colleagues sort of got stumped there for a second and then picked it back up. That was really, really well done.
Thank you.
And that, I think that takes all three of you to do that kind of thing. It's not just one person taking hold of you. Somebody else has to be that chemistry. I think you clearly are well prepared in order to be able to do that.
I thought you did very, very well. I mean, kudos to Rich Bader for the preparation that went into it, because it was clear that you knew your stuff based on substance, and that's certainly critical. I like the fact that you filled all 10 minutes of your time. There was hardly a break in there where people were searching for words. I think you played well off of each other in terms of when somebody was beginning to hesitate, somebody else filled in and picked up for it. I liked the fact that you had a lot of current cases that blended in with the references to John Locke and Hobbes and the other older sources. I also like the fact that you were all poised and did a good job. I mean, presentation is also a good part, as well as knowing the substance. It's how you present it. All of you, I'm sure you were nervous, but you really appeared relaxed. You kept good eye contact. I thought that the pacing and the way you spoke, you just flowed along smoothly, and you interchanged well between each other. So I thought an excellent job.
Just to confirm what my colleagues here have said, you did very, very well. And what I will recommend, if either of you were back up or as your classmates come up, breathe. This is not a firing squad. We're not gonna hurt you. I know you're nervous, but just lighten up a little bit. It's really not that bad. It's not even as important as the Regents test or the AP exam. So there's no penalties here. You were very spontaneous with your responses to our follow-up questions. That is not easy to do. That is extremely difficult. Because I work in the newspaper industry, I was particularly happy to hear that you had modern references, specifically to the challenge to Obama's health bill. Good job. Thank you.
I also want to reinforce what my colleagues have said. I think it's obvious that you're well prepared and you thoroughly do understand the content in this unit, which is obviously a very important unit to the rest of the the rest of the program. One suggestion I would make is that when you start to address the follow-up questions, you can take a few minutes, a few seconds really, to kind of confer as a group. And I've seen groups that do that, and it kind of helps you kind of meld the question and also think about who in the group is going to say what, or who can really take the lead on the question, rather than just have one person feel like, this is my question to answer, and I really don't know a complete answer to it. I think that would help you. And also, I think that may help to relax you more in terms of the follow-up questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice job.
Thank you.